And then after learning how we can use Prisma Migrate in a CI/CD environment, we'll learn how we can fix a failed migration, but it won't be a failed migration per se, but let's save that for the lesson. So one other disclaimer that I'll give is that the workflows we'll cover are specifically for relational databases, except for PlanetScale, because we recommend you use dbpush the entire way, and PlanetScale will handle the SQL or the migrations bit of things. So hopefully we'll be able to cover all this in 90 minutes. It looks like a lot, so buckle up, I guess. Yeah, as for this workshop will also look like Nico's, where we'll walk through the fundamentals, and then we'll also walk through the tasks. I'll encourage you not to tackle them on your own. And then once I'm done, you'll have time to sort of tackle them on your own. And then if you have questions, we'll cover them after everyone's been able to do the workshop. Yeah, so who am I? Who's the person that's trying to give this workshop on Prisma Migrate? Well, I'm Alex Ruheni. I am a developer advocate at Prisma, and we're all about making databases easy and fun to work with because they're hard from personal experience. A lot of trauma in that statement, but yeah. So you can find me on Twitter at Ruheni_Alex, at GitHub at Ruheni. Shoot me an email in case you want to talk about Prisma Migrate, and at Alex Ruheni in the Prisma Slack. And in case you'd like to host this workshop yourself, feel free to ping us, and then I can share the link to the document, and you can make edits, and also the repository that we're going to use for this workshop. So, and in case you haven't joined the Prisma Slack, feel free to join, connect with other folks who are using Prisma. It's a nice community to be around. Yeah, so let's get started. So the first lesson is on migration fundamentals. If only the internet will work. Yep. Yeah, I had to refresh that. So migration fundamentals. We'll cover what Prisma Migrate is, what database migrations are, what a database schema is, and why you would need it in the first place. So what are migrations? So migrations are a controlled set of changes that make changes to your database schema. This could be renaming a column, creating a table, deleting data maybe, in case you really want that adrenaline early in the morning. Yeah, and they're important because they provide like a systematic way for you to evolve your database schema. And we have a really in-depth article on what database migrations are in the data guide. In case you have time after the workshop, I would highly recommend you take a look at it. So when evolving database schema, there are two major patterns for evolving. So the first one is database first migrations, where you write the SQL by hand, in case you're really comfortable with that, and then you run it on your database, and then you would maybe use your tool of choice to introspect. And for example, Prisma offers the DB pool, and .NET offers they call it reverse engineering, and it works. So that is a pattern. You update your schema, the database schema on the database, you introspect, and then you generate the code that describes the structure of your database. And then the second approach is the code first migration. And the code first migration involves defining the shape of the data in the database using your programming language of choice. In this case, we'll use the Prisma schema language. And then the next thing is to run a migration, or use a migration tool to generate the SQL that describes the set of changes that will be applied to your database. Yes, and I included some nice diagrams inside the Notion document for you to help you kind of create like a visual flow how these workflows look like. So there are also other two ways of defining migrations. So the first one is by handwriting them yourself, and if you're comfortable with it, it's okay. There are a lot of opinions out there on the internet on how you should do it, but whatever works for you anyway. Yeah. And the second approach is to use migration tooling or software. And these are automated tools that after you define your schema, they would automatically generate them for you. Some of them offer you the capability to update the SQL before you apply it to your database. For example, Prisma Migrate, and there are a ton of tools out there depending on your language of choice. So ideally, migrations are kind of state management, but for your database. And for folks who are from the front end space, I hope this resonates because state management is hard. And that's what migration software like Prisma Migrate usually helps you solve. You have to make sure that the schema you define in your programming language of choice matches one-to-one to what is defined in your database. So yeah, on top of that, the SQL or the migrations that you define are ideally supposed to be stored together with your application code so that you can sort of create like a version control so that you know at a particular point in time what the state of the database looked like. The other benefit of database migrations is that they allow you to kind of replicate what the database looks like at a particular point in time. And it's helpful when you're working in a team. So let's say I'm working on branch A and I have a coworker who's working on branch B. And if I want to take a look at what they're doing, I can just run the migration that's in the version control or in the application, and then I'll kind of have database that matches whatever they were using, kind of, which is pretty helpful. Now this brings us to Prisma Migrate. You're not supposed to see that. Give me a moment. Sorry. Give me a moment. Perhaps I could ask Nico for the help. Could you resolve the comments on the document for me? Then, yeah. What? Sorry? Or from your end, could you resolve mark some comments as resolved? Oh, yeah, please. Open the page in a private tab, and then you won't be logged in. I have to log in again for me. Because, yeah. So on Notion, yeah. Sorry, I didn't The GitHub CEO couldn't get his slides on the screen yesterday at the conference. The GitHub CEO himself could not get the HDMI connection to the screen. So share, let's continue sharing. So let's continue the migration. Yes. From Frederick and you in the migration fundamentals page. Yes. Yeah. Let me know when you're done. Yeah. Still there. Thought they used WebSockets. Still there. Maybe you have high expectations as developers anyway. Yeah. Anyway, we can still continue with it on the screen. Just eyes on the prize. It's the workshop, not the comments. Yeah. So Prisma Migrate is an automated database migration tools that sort of provides the code first migration approach where you define your schema in the Prisma schema. And then you can use migrate dev or db push to apply whatever's on your Prisma schema to the database schema. So the other workflow, of course, you can take the database first approach. You can use db pull to introspect your database, and then your Prisma schema will be populated for you. So, so the Prisma schema is one of the pieces of state that Prisma Migrate will use as a source of truth. So that's for those who have a notebook, or if you can keep a mental note, remember we'll have 4 pieces of state that Prisma Migrate will use to track the state of a migration. The first one is the Prisma schema as a source of truth. The second one is the migration history that Migrate Dev uses. So it will just compare your whatever is inside the migration folder with whatever is on the database. The third one is the migrations table, which we'll take a look at later, that if a migration has been successfully applied, Prisma auto-generates a table for you under the hood that you never see that tracks that piece of state. And then the final piece that Migrate uses is the database schema. So making sure that whatever is defined in the Prisma schema, the migrations history, and the database migration and the migration table are sort of all in sync. Yes. So we'll incrementally take a look at how Prisma Migrate handles all these pieces of state as we continue with the workshop. And fun fact, we worked on an article last year on how you can sort of use Prisma Migrate on a .NET project to just version control or manage the migrations in your project. So you can use Migrate as a standalone tool. So at this point, are there any questions? Yeah, are there any in the chat? With a new DB, will all migrations be run sequentially? If you have a new database, well, yes, I think they will be run sequentially. That's by Tanay Pant. Yeah, cool. So any questions? Silence. It either means everyone understood or no one understood. So I hope it's everyone understood. Cool. So let's jump into schema prototyping and the loading spinner again. I guess this is why the Remix team kind of built Remix, solve all the loading spinners issues for front-end developers. But well, that's a nice error. They should all be public. Yes. Yeah. Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law, yeah. Well, Tani also shares that it's slow for him as well. Could be a Cloudflare thing, but should work. Yeah, there we go. Cool. So this is the first sort of practical hands-on lesson that we'll have, and we'll kind of prototype a schema a couple of times to understand how you can evolve your database or Prisma schema with DB push. So what DB push does is that it maps your Prisma schema to your database schema without generating any migration for you. And meaning that we'll only have DB push uses two pieces of state to track the state of a database, the Prisma schema and the database schema. So under the hood, what it does is that it introspects the database, and then it kind of does a diff between your Prisma schema and the database schema. And then in case the Prisma schema is ahead or behind, it will infer the changes and then apply it directly to the database. You can think of it as kind of migrations are in memory because they'll never be tracked anywhere in your code. So yeah, and in case you, for example, rename a column or create I'm looking forward for it, a change that will lead to data loss, DB push offers the accept data loss flag that you can use to just, just living on the edge, just.
Otherwise it errors?
It will show you the error that.
That it will throw.
Yes. Yes. So you can just force it with the accept data loss flag. So yeah. So again, this means that we'll never have a migration history, which is the migration folder that Prisma Migrate usually creates. And we'll also not have the migrations table that's created for you under the hood by Prisma Migrate. So yeah, so when should you use DB push? It's a great command. Why not? I mean, you don't need a migration, just apply it as it is. So you can use it when you want to quickly prototype and you don't really care about the state of your database. And yeah, it's perfectly okay for that. And especially when you want to kind of reach like a final state. So that's kind of what we'll do in this lesson. We'll just prototype the entire way until we are happy with the state and then create a migration. And then the other use cases when you don't really need you don't need to customize a migration, for example, to rename a column, sort of, if that makes sense. So let's get started with the practical. So I'll minimize that. Don't take a look at Docker. Is that visible? So let's set up the project. The link is available in the setup step. So first click the setup. Okay, internet is faster. For those who don't have access to it, let me share it in the chat. So let's clone the repository. Then navigate into the directory and npm install dependencies. And then I will open up on VS Code. Cool. So I'll first rename, you'll also need to rename the env.example to .env. And then in case you have Docker available, there's a Docker compose file that you can use. I'll have to rename a port of mine because it's already taken and it will throw an error. So I'll use 5435. Yep, and then I'll run Docker compose up to start it up. Again, you can set a database up on Railway, completely free. You'll skip the Docker step. So yep, everything is running. Then let's get started with that was the setup. So the first task is to create a model called product with the following fields: an ID that's a uniquely identifiable string. So inside, let me minimize, open my schema, and I'll define the model called product. This is kind of like mob coding. It's live and but it's a mob. People are watching me, so yeah, there's pressure. So yeah. So we'll have the first field called ID. We'll have it a string, and we'll use the @ID, and it will be a string. So we'll have the @default UUID. I'll use UUID. Cool. We'll have the name, that's a string. And then we'll have SKU, that's a string. It's also required. Price will be a required value, price of the product. So I will choose the decimal type. Sure. Should I go bigger?
No, that's
cool. And then we'll have created that and updated that. That's a date time, and we'll use the default now. Yes, we'll use the same for updated that. But we'll have the updated that attribute for the value in the field to be updated whenever we update a record in a certain column. So I'll hit save. And then once you're ready, we'll compare the solution. I am confident. Who knows, things might go wrong again. So the next task is pushing the schema to the database, and we will use the Prisma DB push command. So on my terminal, I will clear things up and run npx Prisma DB push. Authentication failed. A nice, lovely error. Oh, I might have not updated my environment variable. Yes, that was my error. 435, that was the problem. And rerun this again. And it's done. So you can see the other thing that Prisma DB push does is generate Prisma client for you, or any other assets that you define inside the Prisma schema. So one thing I'd like you to now do is look at what the structure of the database looks like. So if you have Postico or Table Plus, you can use it, but to lower the barrier of entry, we'll use the Postgres client, which I already have installed. So it's called database. I will delete this one, which is the one. So in the creation, click the create connection, then select Postgres. We'll use a connection string and then paste it in here and connect. And we can see that we have the, that's not supposed to happen. Give me a moment. Oh, wait. Well, let's just drop all the tables. I think this is because I had Docker already running, so that's why it was still hanging in there. So I will rerun db push. And I will refresh here, and you can see that we have the product table. I'll double click on this. Then they have an option for show table DDL, and table DDL stands for database definition language, to see the SQL that was kind of applied to the database. So you can see that we have the create product, table product, and this is the SQL that Prisma DB push used under the hood to create the table for you. With that out of the way, the next thing that we'll also take a look at is updating our schema with the native types. Yes, so inside here, so for native type attributes, they allow you to kind of, so Prisma under the hood usually uses default types for specific columns. For, as we've seen on Postgres, it uses text for string. However, you can go be a little bit more specific with native type attributes. And native type attributes start with the @db prefix because of the data source, the name of the data source that we have in the Prisma schema. So for the name column, we'll use the a variable character, the varchar, with 400 characters. So I'll update it here. I have to make this a little smaller. Well, that doesn't look good. Front end is hard. Front end is hard. So back here, we'll again name 100 characters. So I'll use the @db.varchar. 100 characters. And the same for the description, but we'll use 1,000 characters. Yep. Where's the, oh, we skipped the description. How delightful. Yeah. Let's see how we can prototype. Yeah. So description, we'll have a string, save that, run db push again.
You first need to pass it as a string, or could you do it directly? You could have done it directly to Archer, right?
We're updating the Prisma schema first because I skipped a field in the Prisma schema. So yes, I forgot to add the description column. Yes.
Yeah, but you could have done it directly there, like the first time directly.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, we're just showing how you can kind of prototype quickly. So yeah, so let's evolve it and use the varchar for name, db varchar. Description will have 1,000 characters. 1,000, and then for price, we'll use a money type that Postgres offers. Feel free to still stick to decimal, but that's completely up to you. So I'll use @db.money. And then for the created that, we'll use the time zone, timestamp without a time zone. So that should be @db.time. And then for updated that, we'll create a timestamp with a time zone. It's just having fun here. Yeah, just prototyping. Yeah, so at db.timex times terms. Yep. That looks pretty good. I'll rerun. Yes?
Just minor thing, but I'm using the railway Postgres DB,
Uh-huh.
and it tells me, so the client is code plugin tells me that DB varchar is not supported for Postgres SQL connector.
DB?
The DB type, the varchar, is not supported for Postgres connector.
Oh, so let's first finish and then I'll help you take a look at it. So yeah, so let's run DB push again. That worked. Hopefully we didn't forget anything this time. So back to the database. And then I will refresh it here. And then we'll look at the table DDL. And you can see that the structure has changed. And now we have the character that's varying for the name. You can see that the created at has a time without time zone. Seems Postgres has an interesting, uses an interesting SQL under the hood. But yeah, this is what was applied under the hood to update the database schema. None of them were breaking, but this is how you can iterate on your database schema. And that should be it for the first lesson. Congratulations. So I'll leave you with about 7 to 10 minutes to go through the first task. Make sure you define the schema, prototype with DB push, and then take a look at the structure under the hood and what it looks like. And again, back to the whole trying to make it stick with the, state management. Remember that, again, we don't have any migration history, but we can see the SQL that was applied under the hood for you. So yeah, have fun. Okay, we'll move on to the next task on developing with Prisma Migrate. And there we get the loading spin again. So in this lesson, we learn how you can use Prisma Migrate in your development workflow and now start creating migration history in your database. So Prisma Migrate, unlike DB push, as we just seen, automatically generates the SQL migration files and stores them in your migration history, and also uses the migrations table to sort of track the state of a migration. So you will see them in the tasks that we'll undertake. Yeah. One other thing to note about migrate dev is that it's a development specific command and you shouldn't use it in production. And it's intended to be used with sort of disposable databases that, you know, you're okay losing the data like in development. However, there are specific cases, development workflows that are different and we understand. So what does Prisma Migrate do under the hood? So the first thing is that it creates something called a shadow database. And a shadow database is a second database that it uses to detect problems such as something called a schema drift. And a schema drift means that your database schema is ahead or behind the Prisma schema. The next thing that Migrate does is that it replaces the existing migrations that you have stored in your migration history onto the shadow database. And then it uses it to detect the drift. And then it applies any pending migrations, i.e. the new migration that you might have created onto the shadow database. And then it generates a new migration based on the changes in the Prisma schema. And then, yeah, sorry, I'm confusing myself. So it applies the pending migrations, i.e. let's say your coworker created a new migration that you don't have on your system. So it applies that. And then it generates a new migration based off of that. And then it applies it, i.e. the one that you just created it to your database and also updates the Prisma migrations table under the hood. And then once the entire process is complete, it will delete the shadow database for you. And then it will then trigger generation of artifacts such as Prisma client. Yeah, I also included a nice illustration from a former coworker on what the whole process of Migrate does. It's a comic and it's fun and it's insightful. In case you have some time, take a look at it. I understand being a visual learner is better because you get to concepts sink in a little better. So So we'll continue from the previous lesson where we, of course, use DB push. But if you want sort of a fresh start, feel free to stash and then check out Prisma Migrate. But if you've been following along, everything will be good. So back in our project, the first task is to initialize the migration history to generate the first migration, of course. So in my terminal, I'll run npx Prisma Migrate dev. One other thing is that, we'll run Prisma Migrate dev, and then we'll give the migration a name or called init. And then because we don't have any, so I'm not sure if we can be able to see this clearly. So you can see that Prisma Migrate has detected a drift to the database because we don't have any migration history. So it's trying to create one because, of course, what it's just saying that whatever you have in your Prisma schema doesn't match with whatever I have, but maybe it matches with whatever is under the hood in the database. So you can see that it says that that tables, and it will prompt you to reset your database. But if you're in development, it's okay to reset, I hope. And of course, you're told that data will be lost because I'm in development. I'll just live a little bit more on the edge and accept it. A moment. Generated the new migration, and the database is now in sync with the Prisma schema. And if we take a look at the migration that was generated over here, it's kind of exactly what we saw on the Postgres extension. If we compare it side by side, show table DDL, trying to minimize this. If you compare it side by side, you can see that whatever Migrate sort of created is exactly the same as whatever is applied under the hood in the database. So yes, the other thing that you should also see in the database client is when I refresh the tables, you can see that there's a Prisma migrations table. So if we open it up, we will see that it's metadata about whatever is inside your migration history. Created an ID, the checksum, and then it was finished at that time. There wasn't any rollback. And this means it was kind of a successful migration. So that's the first task, just initializing the migration history and just taking a look at under the hood on what Prisma Migrate uses. Cool. So next, we'll evolve the schema again by creating another model called category. So I'll close this up. So Alim asks whether metadata is stored in the shadow database. It's not, because it's automatically created and deleted for you under the hood. This is not something you have to worry about. However, if you're using a cloud-hosted database, you have to define the shadow database yourself, meaning it will continue existing. Yes. So the next task on evolving the schema, we'll define a new model called category. We'll give it an ID, because I'm a lazy developer, just copy and paste it. Give it a name, which is a string. And then we'll create an implicit many-to-many relationship with products. And then finally, we'll also update the product model with the relationship. So over here, because that's why there's an error. So categories, category. Yep. That's it. And then generate another migration. Give it a name. I'll call it add category table. Please work. Fingers crossed. Yep, it was successful. So if we take a look at the migration history, you can see that the migration is also stored in version control. So if you take a look at it, you can see that created the table, and we have something called a join table for many-to-many relationships called A and B, and then a couple of indexes to it. And then if we go back to the database client extension, I'll refresh it again. You can see that we have the category to product join table and the category table. And if you also inspect the DDL for category, it's specifically what it maps to whatever we specified inside the Prisma schema. And if we also take another look at the migration history, oh no, I'm not supposed to see the table DDL for Prisma migrations. So if we take a look at this, we can see that there is another sort of timestamp. Inside the migration name, you can see the first one we called it init, and this is where it's stored. And the second one is the category table that's also here. It was successful. So yeah, and that's just about it for tracking history of changes. So I'll give you another 7 to 10 minutes to evolve again, to create a baseline, apply create the migration, and then just take a look under the hood, what it looks like. So we'll jump into the next lesson on customizing migrations. Yep. The goal of the customizing migrations lesson is to help you learn how, let's say you can, Prisma Migrate will take you as far as you can, but sometimes tools, automation is not as smart sometimes, even though I kind of hate to use those words on our own products, but yeah, they can only take you so far. So, for example, when you want to rename a column, Prisma Migrate doesn't know that you want to rename a column. So what it will say is that it will take it as you want to delete a column and then create a new column under the hood. But to prevent such a drastic change, you can sort of edit a migration before it's applied to the database. And then once you're ready, sort of customizing the migration, you can then run it on your database so that you can avoid such situations. It's also useful if you want to, as I mentioned before, enabling extensions, like one we'll use in this lesson is Cytext. There's also PostGIS and the different extensions that you have in the space. So let's jump into it. So as I mentioned in the introduction, the Prisma schema is, I've unmuted myself. Oh, wait, sorry. I skipped a question by Tani and asking what is a migration drift. So a migration drift or a schema drift is an error that my Prisma Migrate will throw when the Prisma schema and the database schema do not match. Could be that one is ahead or one is behind, and it's sort of trying to make sense of it and sort of throw you a warning that at this point in time, one is not correct, kind of. And we'll learn how we can sort of fix that in the last lesson. Yes. So, the Prisma schema is an abstraction over your database, and it won't completely provide you with like 100% of the functionality. Sometimes you will have to go out of your way to sort of fix it using SQL. It's the bit that we don't like sometimes as front-end developers, just database stuff, but you have to do what you have to do to make the bread, right? Yeah. So yeah, so Prisma Migrate supports this workflow where you can edit a migration before it's applied using a create only flag. And then once you're done editing a migration, what you can do is run it again, run Prisma Migrate dev, and then it will apply the migration. So again, whatever we have in this lesson will build on whatever we had in the previous lesson. So I just lost VS Code. Oh, wait, yeah, there it is. So the first task is that we'll add the Cytext use the site text native type on the name column. And the site text extension allows you to sort of query a column in a case insensitive manner, if that makes sense. So you don't have to auto capitalize or set things to lowercase when you're searching through the column. So we'll first add the site text native type to name. I already used nvar_char. That's a bummer. So I'll just replace it with site text. That should be it. And then if I try run the migration as is, spoiler alert, this will fail because I haven't enabled the extension. So npx Prisma Migrate dev, don't do this. Yeah, it's hard to fix, it's kind of. And name, we'll call it add site text native type. Yeah, so change the which no cast exists, column would be dropped. Yeah, surprisingly, I barely understand the error. Yeah. But I think the error, what it's trying to tell us is that the extension doesn't exist in the database and you have to enable it yourself. So I'll first reset the migrations. So give me a moment. So yeah, so you can see it's altering the table, dropping, and then recreating the column again, kind of, and this is not the desired state. So a hacky workaround right now, what I'm going to do is delete this migration. Don't do this. It was just to show you that the migration will automatically fail. So I will delete this. And then I will reset the migrations, sort of. So with npx Prisma Migrate reset. So it will reset the database and then reapply all npx Prisma Migrate or rest. Okay, reset, if I could type correctly. Yep, I don't have any data. So yeah, it deletes, drops all the tables and the columns and then reapplies all the migrations that you have. So we will recreate the migration.
Sorry.
Yes.
So it does not go back to the latest migration files, but it starts from scratch and rewrites.
Yes,
okay.
Runs all the migrations. Yes. So, and then we'll use the create only flag to create a draft migration. Docker is slow. We can now edit the migration. I'll minimize the terminal and we should.
I have a question. Because
Yes.
you deleted it and you could modify that one and rerun it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's just that that problem was kind of hard to fix at the moment, and the easiest way without taking too much time is just reset. Yeah, just like restarting a project. Yeah. So I made a tiny mistake and called it. I gave it the wrong name. Called it. Yeah. Can someone see the spot the error? Have two migrations with the same name, but has a timestamp. This is the one that we want to edit, so I will rename it directly from here. And then what I will do is enable the extension, create extension if not exists. That's also a migration can fail if, for example, you also have a typo inside a migration file. So that's if you, just any typo. Then we'll call it site text. So I will confirm that whatever I have is correct. Yep. Don't look at the solution. Just look at it after you've tried, but probably too late now. Site text. That looks good. One other thing is that it's, as you can see, it's dropping the column and then recreating it again. For now, I think it's okay. Just take note of that. So we'll rerun the migration again. Migrate dev. Yep. And it worked successfully. Yeah. Applied the migration that we just created in the database. So if we take a look again at, I have to minimize all these editors. If we take a look at the Prisma migration folder, we'll see that we know that we have 3 migrations in our migration history, and you can still see in the migrations table, we have 3 entries inside the Prisma migrations table. So again, just remember end to end that source of truth is the Prisma schema, then create a migration history, which is tracked inside the migration table, and then finally applied to the database schema. State management, kind of Redux, I guess, in some way. Yeah. Yeah, and then the next task that we have is renaming a field. So if we take a look back at the Prisma schema, so the task is to rename description to content. I ran out of names for the task, but we'll rename description to content. And the moment you run Prisma Migrate dev, should see a huge warning telling you that whatever change you're trying to make, oh, I didn't give it a name. So what is it? Rename column. So we should get an error. Oh, wait, that was not supposed to happen. So let's see what happened. Let's fix it. At least we know this is live. That was not supposed to happen, but I guess it happened because we can take it the other way around anyway, and create a record in our database with Prisma Studio. I think it just skipped it because we don't have any data in our table, and that's why it just was like, screw it, let's just do it. Studio. And then the product, I will create, sorry, I can barely see, add a record. Let's call it stickers. The content will be stickers, stickers, stickers. Very creative. Thank you. SKU, that looks right. That's just about it. And then save the change. And then, so let's go back to the Prisma schema. Then migrate dev, add, nope, that was not the one. Migrate dev dash name, rename description. Yep. Oh wait, we haven't changed it in the Prisma schema. I just forgot that. Did we change it? Schema. So we want to change it back to description. And then let's see. Yep. Changes could not be executed. Added step 0, which required, it makes no sense, kind of. You can use the create only to create a migration. So we can see that the change could not be executed. So let's try fix it. This is all live. I did not encounter this error while preparing. So we are fixing it live. Yeah, so we'll use the create only. Or we can use a different name. Does anyone have a synonym for content or description? synonym. Sorry?
Text.
Yeah. We're great at namings, right? Yeah, so let's do that. Rename description. Wait, so let's do it without the create only flag. Yep, could not be executed. There are, yeah, one row in this table, so it's not possible. So we'll use the create only flag. Are you sure you want to create migration? I think so. I think so. Yep. Cool. And now in our migration history, we have the rename column. So it's dropping content and then recreating it. This is not what we want, so we'll rename it. So alter table, yep. So instead of drop column, we use rename, the S, yep. Rename content. And then over here, we'll use the to text, and then we don't need the data type because it's already set for us. And then let's rerun this. And it worked live. That was unexpected. I'm proud of myself. So cool. So that way we've seen that we've been able to sort of, rename a column without data loss. And that's what the power of, customizing migrations enables you to do. So in the meantime, I'll give you another 5 to 7 minutes to tackle the lesson, and then we'll answer any questions that will come up after the time is up. Cool. Hope you got to try it out. Yeah, some live programming is not that bad for you. It's an extreme sport. It's good exercise, kind of. So the next lesson is learning how we can use Prisma Migrate in a CI/CD environment. And let's not confuse Prisma Migrate with just the migrate dev command, because Prisma Migrate also provides another more suite of tools. And let me, have I unmuted myself online? Yeah, I should also share my video. Yeah. So we'll use in this lesson, we'll use migrate deploy to learn how we can run migrations in a CI/CD environment. And the idea is that migrate deploy should be run in an automated sort of environment, and you can still use it locally, but it's ideally supposed to be used against a production or staging kind of environment. So under the hood, migrate dev will compare the changes that you have on your database with whatever is in the migrate history. And then in case there are any migrations that have not yet been applied, migrate deploy will apply them to the database. So it syncs the migration history that you used from your local environment sort of to the production environment. So I also forgot to answer questions again. So Tani asked whether renaming a folder directly has any implications or conflicts with the migration table. I guess it might if the migration has already been applied to the database. It's not something I have tried out yet, but as long as it's not yet applied, I guess alles good, everything will be okay. Yes, so let's continue. So in this task, you'll create a GitHub workflow called test, and then we'll add sort of a configuration to toggle the migrations to be run in CI. And then the contents of the file should be here, and I'll explain it in just a moment. So I left a to-do over there where you'll just add the migrate to deploy step. And then once you've made the changes, create a GitHub repository, push your changes, and then you can see the action being executed on your end. So on my locally, I'll go ahead and create the folder, the file. So minimize that. So GitHub slash workflows slash test.yaml. And then I will paste this in, copy the configuration. So what it does is once the GitHub action is executed, it runs a job called test, and test will set up a Postgres database just within the GitHub action, and then it will expose the database URL environment variable over here. Should put that in full screen. Yep. And then once the database is set up, it will check out into that commit, set up node, and then run npm install. And then over here, in case you have tests, you can also include them here. We're only going to see how we can run migrate deploy. So I'll add the extra step. So run, and then npx Prisma migrate deploy. And then I will push my changes to the branch, which I probably shouldn't because folks will use it, but I can always revert it. So I'll just push. Good commit messages. Sync the changes. Then over on GitHub, inside the repository, the actions tab. Yep. We take a look at it, see that the job is starting. I hope GitHub actions will work today. Yeah, initializing containers, that should be the Postgres database. And in the meantime, you can now sort of get started, and then, yeah, I'm only waiting for this task. That's it, npx. So action setup, npm install. Yes, and as we can see right over here, wait, we lost it. Migrate deploy task, we can see it just applied all pending migrations to the database in CI. And yeah, that's exactly what migrate deploy does. So you can also set up an action when you merge. You can run migrate deploy as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It doesn't generate any assets in case you're curious, except it just does that one thing. Any questions before we tackle it? You had a question on migrate deploy. Yes.
Maybe if you talk about data loss with migrate deploy.
Data loss.
Yes, like what's the best workflow to catch it before
Okay. So if the changes would have been detected locally with migrate dev, that's, I guess, the step when you can fix it, I guess. Otherwise, migrate deploy doesn't care whether there's a schema drift or anything. It just applies anything that hasn't been applied yet to the database. Yes. So if you detect, if you have like a breaking change, I guess, let's say you want to rename a column, or renaming is a simple one, sort of migrate from one column to another one. You can use the expand and contract pattern where, let's say, you introduce the new column and then you can write to the new column. And then you can also create a script with the Prisma client to migrate the data from the old column to the new one. And then once you're ready, you can drop the column once it doesn't have any data.
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is like, what intermediate step other than development is best to touch it on, even junior developer, something sensitive anyway, or something of the sort? Or do you basically just rely on backups?
I guess you'd rely on backups in this case. Yeah, but if you have tests in CI, I hope they can catch them. But the moment you merge, you can maybe, right now we don't have a data migration workflow yet with Migrate, but you can write a script, and because Prisma client is type safe, you're kind of guaranteed that if you transfer data from one column to another, it would work, kind of. Does that make sense?
More, yeah, but like for raw queries and stuff like that.
Or raw queries.
You could perfectly miss it, like a couple of things. Like that's basically what I do. I'm just never sure, like, if they're like, once I have my way, but I'm not sure if it's the right way to, the best way to do it, like, or what stage to catch if there's going to be data loss. Maybe do it with a flag or something like that.
I guess that could be an interesting like feature request. Like again, Migrate Dev will be the one that will catch the data loss, I guess. And then that's a situation when you can kind of fix it. Does that answer the question? Okay. Almost, yeah. Any other question?
With Prisma deploy when it comes with Prisma Migrate, it cannot delete data.
It won't, but if you have SQL that deletes data, then yes.
So you should make a migration create only, but you don't apply it with Prisma Migrate. Then it will apply it.
Yes. Yes. Cool. Any questions? So the next one is going to be intense. We're going to do a diffing, a little bit of diffing. Yeah. So Alim has a question on when he runs migrate reset in YAML, he gets the error P1012 environment variable not found. I guess one fix is to rename. I'm not sure if you are using you rename the .env.example to .env, but that should help fix it in the meantime. Yeah. So we have 1 minute to go through migrate diff.
Warning that you get disconnected.
Sorry?
Display the warning that the meeting will end for 1 minute.
Ah, Scheiße.
Might get disconnected.
Yeah, that should not happen. Stop screen share. Let me try change that setting. Webinars. And it ended, sadly. Well, would you like to continue the last step on migrate diff? Kind of. I just have to figure out how to share. Cool. Could have been a configuration issue. Are any of you attending the Nest.js workshop? Ah, okay. Huh. I still don't know how to share this my screen. Give me a moment. In the meantime.
And now, like for me, it's fine because you will share also the notebook with us, right? It's
Yeah.
Like I don't know what notebook is. Because I'm jumping in.
So I can give like a 1 minute. Sadly, those who are online will miss it. I'm not sure if I can restart it. Oh wait, can folks in the chat still hear me? Yep.
Yeah, the Zoom meeting might just continue on.
Yes. Oh, so the Zoom meeting is continuing. So let the show go on. So we'll quickly run through this last step, which is troubleshooting failed migrations. So may I have your attention a little bit? Yeah. So five minutes max, hopefully. Folks online as well kind of, yeah, are listening in. So there are times when you're trying to apply a migration, it fails and you get a warning that your schema has drifted. And this means, again, your database schema or Prisma schema, one of them is ahead of the other. So you might incur failed migration if, let's say, you have a typo, or let's say you have a constraint that's not applied, or you add a not null constraint to a column that has data, kind of. Meaning can't really do it, or migration fails, or a database shuts down in the middle of the migration process. So again, as we stated numerous times, that Prisma Migrate tracks the state of a migration in the migration table. So if it fails, it would be recorded inside this, oh, I'm not sharing my screen. So if we take a look at the notebook, it tracks the changes in the Prisma migrations table if it fails or succeeds. So one way you can fix it is, one, roll back the change, for example, to a previous state, fix the change, and then reapply the migrations. And then the other way you can fix it is to manually complete it yourself. So in this step, let's skip the task. So this task will sort of simulate a failed migration with a schema drift. In that I'll manually move the database schema ahead, meaning this Prisma schema will be behind, so will the Prisma migrations and the migrations table. And I'll only run through the task where we want to move back the database schema to be in sync with all three. I guess this would be kind of like homework for you. It's in there where you move the database schema ahead again, and then you now move the Prisma migrations, the migrations table, and the Prisma schema ahead in time. I don't know, sounds complex, but it's not. Yeah. So a couple of releases ago, we released the migrate diff command, which kind of compares your database schema and the Prisma schema. You can also do a diff of your migration history and a database or any other database. So let's sort of, I'll run the SQL to create a table that doesn't exist in the Prisma schema. So I have Postico installed. So sadly, give me a moment. Fixed. So I'll run some SQL to create a table in the database, and we can confirm this over here. Once we refresh, we can see there's an order table. And then I will use the Prisma Migrate diff command to sort of create a diff of whatever is in the database schema to match whatever is in my Prisma schema. So npx Prisma Migrate diff. And the first argument that we'll give it is the database URL. So from URL, so it should be whatever is inside the env file. And then paste it in here. And then we will, we want it to match whatever is inside this Prisma schema. So to schema data model. And then we'll give it a path to the Prisma schema. So Prisma/schema. And then the last thing that we want to do is generate some SQL, which we'll be able to execute in the database. So that will be script, and we want to output it inside, we'll call it rollback.sql. And the commands are non-interactive. So if we take a look at rollback.sql, what it tells us to do is drop the table in the database because it's ahead. So how can we execute the schema? Of course, you can execute it directly on Postico, but the other utility command that we provided exposed to users is the db execute. So we can sort of execute an SQL file directly.
So you give us an SQL key.
So it's a diff, and then so we want to.
But we have an SQL key because I could run any SQL script with the thing that we're going to show.
So it only does a diff, and then it generates the SQL to sort of help match the schemas. So the next thing is to execute it with db execute. So that will be npx Prisma db execute, and then we will pass in the URL. And then we will, the file name is, sorry, I forgot. Yes. Then the file was called rollback.sql. And if we execute it, it worked. If we go back here and refresh the tables, you can see that the table is gone. And if we run, we should have run this once we created the table, there would have been a schema drift. But if you run Prisma Migrate dev, it will tell us that the database schema is in sync, so there's no change that should be made. Yes. Yeah, schema is in sync, so yeah. So the next challenge that I will leave for you attendees now, for whoever's online and in person, you can try out, move the database forward again, and then you can sort of now move the Prisma schema, migrations table, and the migration history all on your own. Is a solution in case you get stuck. But yeah, let me know how it goes. Thanks for attending, and it was delightful to have you here.